Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and today I'm going to talk about why feeding your bees can help them. So the short of it is really, feeding can definitely help bees at certain times of the year. It doesn't make them sick. So what bees need to survive is the pollen, which is fats and protein, and then nectar, which is sugar. It's sucrose sugar. And that's what the beehives live off of. They will starve if they don't have any sugar in their hive or they're not bringing any in. It's not like humans where we like eating sugar, but it's not good for us. For the bees, it's absolute necessity that they have sugar. Otherwise, they will literally just die. The hive will not be able to survive at all. When is it a good time to feed your bees and why? So I think of three main situations when it comes to feeding bees. There are plenty of other ones, I'm sure, but these are the ones that come to my mind. So first of all, like stimulatory feeding in the spring. So you're feeding the bees to make sure that they have, that they're going to grow quickly and build up for the flow. Second situation would be when the honey flow is ended in the summer and you want to keep the bees going. And a hive will die or at least decline a lot if it doesn't have any sugar in the hive, because during that dearth period, no food's coming in, and if they don't have any in the hive, it's a really big issue. So that's the other type of feeding. And the third type of feeding, which I do most commonly, which is fall feeding. So bees need a lot of food to go over winter when you're in the north. In the south, you need less, but still some. So every fall in September until mid-October, I am feeding my bees tons and tons of sugar. I spent a lot of money. It was like 600 pounds of sugar last fall that I bought from like Walmart in 25-pound bags. And this is, like my bees would be dead right now if I didn't do that feeding, because some places just don't get a fall flow. So that's fall feeding. So I'm going to go into depth on each one. So if a hive does not have much honey or nectar during the after the summer flow, it's wise to feed them. And this can do two things. One, you can either feed them for a short amount of time and make sure they have, get them back up to 2 or 3 frames of honey, and then so they have enough food to survive for a month, a few weeks, whatever it is before your next nectar. Or you can do some other kind of stimulatory or just stimulatory feeding, which would be to feed them really light sugar syrup for a long time. So 1/2 to 1 sugar syrup, so half part water to 1 part, or half part sugar to 1 part water. And this helps the bees. So you can do this stimulatory feeding because it helps them rear brood. You could potentially even get them to draw some comb depending on the time of year and how much you feed them. So that's why you would feed after the summer honey flow to, just replace that sugar in the nest, or to keep them going and keep building up the hive. And you may not feed them a lot, but some amount can go a long way for the honeybees. Especially, feeding is especially important during the summer dearth if it's a split. Like let's say you made a nuke during the honey flow and you put it into a 10-frame box in July, but that baby hive didn't store a bunch of honey during the honey flow because it was too small and didn't have that many foragers. Which in this case would be very important to feed it during that feeding during the dearth period before the fall flow if you get one, and that will allow the bees to keep building up before winter. Because if you don't, then the hive's just going to start going backwards and it'll have no shot at making through the winter. Whether you live in the south or the north, if there's not much left come September, it's not going to go well. So make sure you're feeding your splits during the dearth. It's not like every single split needs to be fed, but a lot of them could use feed during the dearth. So the second type of feeding would be feeding in the early spring. So a lot of people feed in the early spring to help build up the colony for the honey flow, and this can have a lot of value in it, because if you can increase their population enough, you're going to increase them a lot more, then you're going to get a lot more honey. It's pretty simple, or a lot more splits, or whatever you want. So the Bee Whisperer, he's up in Hamden, Maine. He has some other yards in other towns, but he does a lot of feeding really early in April, which is very interesting to me because my bees won't even take syrup in April. So I don't know if it's because of the buckets or what it is, but I've never had hives be able to really take sugar syrup in April. But he feeds them a ton in April, or not a ton, but a couple buckets of sugar syrup, and that gets his hives going full force right out of the gate, going crazy. So works for him. So maybe I'll try that. But last spring I didn't feed any hives except my mating nukes. None of them needed it. If any of them needed honey, I just swapped frames, and that worked really well for me. So I didn't really have to do any simulatory feeding, but a lot of people do feed before the honey flow. I'm talking pretty long before the honey flow, like month, 2 months, something like that. And in this situation, you definitely want to use light syrup. So half a part sugar to 1 part water, or 1 part sugar to 1 part water. My recipe is 8 pounds of sugar for 1-to-1. 8 pounds of sugar to 16 cups of water, which is 1 gallon. And I'll mix it up in a bucket. And that's what I would feed. That or even lighter, like 1/2 to 1. Can't remember, Bob Binney, I think said that 3/4 parts sugar to 1 part water is actually the best, what he's found to be the best for drawing out comb. So I'll have to try that out. I'm not sure, I've never really done that. So the third situation happens most commonly for me, which is feeding for the fall flow. So for the fall flow, I feeding after the fall flow is over, or if you just don't get one. It's super important. Bob Binney feeds his bees from August till October most years, a slow, steady build into winter. And I'm considering doing that here, but what I've done in the past is fed 2-to-1 from like mid-September to mid-October. And what I found is I do all single deeps pretty much. I've got 2 doubles, but those are just for making queens. My single deeps generally need, 60 to 70 pounds of sugar, which is about 10 gallons of 2-to-1. And that has worked pretty well for me. I haven't lost any hives to starving that I mean, for certain. Like all the hives that I've opened up I found some amount of honey. That doesn't mean they necessarily didn't starve, but it seems likely that they didn't. And so feeding a lot in the fall has really worked out well for me. I mean, my bees have made it through, pretty much all my hives have made it through the winter. I'm like, I think 85, 86% in my first 5 years. So I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, I'd love to get it to 90, 95%, but that'd be really good. Anyways, so fall feeding can be very important. A lot of places don't get fall flows. So feeding 2-to-1 in the fall can be very effective very effective to get them ready for winter. The warmer the temperatures are in the fall, the faster the bees are able to take down the sugar syrup. So ideally you can feed earlier in the fall, but if you're waiting for your fall flow and then it doesn't happen, you may need to, you're going to be feeding later, so it's not going to be as warm. Typically what I found is you need about 10 gallons of sugar syrup, which is 60 to 70 pounds of sugar. And I'm a big advocate of feeding enough in the fall so you don't need to emergency feed in the spring. I still had to this year, but that's because I didn't have a car, so I wasn't able to get to my out yards to start to feed enough. And I figured the bees can take about 4 gallons a week of 2-to-1. And so really get as much food as you can into them during the fall so you don't need to emergency feed in the spring. It's a lot easier on the bees if they just have the food in the frames rather than you having to open up the hive and disturb them to put on sugar. So really try to do your best to get all your feed on during the fall, and so you don't have to feed during the winter. One last thing when it comes to feeding, in the late fall, there's not a lot of nectar around, and it's not super warm, so that can help with robbing. But one thing is you need to consider is if you spill a lot of sugar syrup everywhere and it's a warm day, you can definitely start robbing because there's probably not any food in October here. And so make sure that you're careful when you're feeding and make sure you get enough in them. And that's the goal. Make sure they have a full deep box of honey. That's what I've found that works to get them through the winter. If you're interested in more educational content just like this, go down below, hit that subscribe button, and hit the bell to be notified when I upload, and I will see you in the next one.